In this first session, I want to present an overview of what church revitalization is. Just before I start, I want to say two things. First of all, introduce myself a little bit. I won't spend a long time doing it. Some of you I have already met in different places or online. I am a pastor in Paris, France. I've been I was involved for 3 decades in church planting, both in Paris and in the provinces. And for the last decade, I was involved in church revitalization, and the Lord enabled my wife and I to revitalize a church in central Paris. And we left that church a few months ago in the hands of a younger couple. And so we are starting opening a new page of the book of our life, consulting as a consultant for church revitalization, but also starting a new little church where we live. I also worked for many years in the student movement in France, the GBU, for 13 years, which is a great time. I teach revitalization in Bible school in Paris and in Geneva, Switzerland. And I head up the Evangelism Commission of the National Council of Evangelicals in France. That's just a few things. I've been married to Mary for 40 years. We have 4 children and 11 grandchildren. So that's not bad. Anyway, it's really good to be with you all, and I hope to get to know you a little more as the week goes by. So the first thing I wanted to say was who I am. The second thing, I know that some people here have already heard quite a lot of what I've said in this first session. All I can plead is with a verse from the Bible. It's in Jude, verse 5. He wrote, "Although you already know all this, I want to remind you." So Jude can say that in the scriptures. Okay, I'll allow myself to repeat what some of you have already heard. And we have to do this because the new ones coming on board need to know what the overview is of church revitalization. The reasons for the network. And the first thing I want to say is that when we consider church revitalization, we're always thinking in terms of a vision and a process. If people don't have if there isn't a vision for where we're going or what we should be doing in each individual church, it's never going to be the same everywhere. There must be a vision. And then the idea that it's just necessary over a period of months or even years to put this vision into place through a process. So the two aspects are the vision and the process. Why the need for revitalization? Well, when I started revitalizing in a church in Paris, I'd never heard the word. This was 10 years ago. I came in and I used the vocabulary, the only vocabulary I knew. I said, I'm going to replant this church. And I had an assistant at that time who did research for me and started saying, "Hey, David, there's a whole lot of stuff in North America about revitalization." So she did research for me. And one of the things we found was this diagram, which we found on several websites of different denominations in North America, saying that in fact, only between 10 and 15% of churches were really healthy and multiplying. And between 70 and 75% were plateauing or declining. And even 10 or 15% were at or near risk of just purely and simply disappearing, becoming extinct. And if that is true in North America, it's probably true, if not more, probably even more true in some places in Europe. So although plateauing as such isn't terrible, at least the church is there, the danger is that if the plateau continues, it starts declining. And we have to be very, very careful of that. So I said to myself, okay, that's a figure for North America. What about in France? And as I said, I chaired the Evangelism Commission of the National Council of Evangelicals. So I was in a good position to contact the leaders of the 22 denominations affiliated to what we call the CNEF. And I asked them to respond to a very brief questionnaire, which was subjectively or intuitively, what percentage of your churches would you put in healthy and multiplying? What percentage in plateauing and declining? And what percentage in at risk of disappearing? So this was not a very serious scientific investigation, but it did give us some idea of where we were in France. So I got all their figures together, and I made this following diagram that according to their figures, 51% of churches in France were healthy and multiplying, that 38% were plateauing or declining, and 11% at or near risk of just plainly and simply disappearing. It didn't surprise me in one sense, because there have been such a growth of churches in the last 50 years in France, a lot of church planting. And so it doesn't surprise me that we had 51% of churches which were deemed to be healthy and multiplying. But if you add up the 38 and the 11, that makes 49%. That means half the churches, even so, needed revitalization. So revitalization, even in a country where you can say the evangelical movement is moving forward, was a real necessity. And we have taken that on board within the CNEF, the National Council of Evangelicals, and have been working on it. This is a picture of an animal. I don't know how many people recognize it. I'm sure that Miles does in Australia. I was once in Tasmania where they mentioned, and then I went to North Island, as they said. And this was actually in a zoo in Hobart, and it's called the Tasmanian Tiger. And it's an animal that disappeared in 1936. It was thought of as being dangerous for the farmers, killing the animals. It's a bit like a kind of dog. It's a marsupial. And that animal just disappeared in 1936. This was the last living specimen in a zoo in Hobart. And I have this picture on my desk in front of my eyes so that I pray every day and say, Lord, let not this happen to our churches. They mustn't disappear like this animal disappeared. They mustn't become extinct. So how can we recognize the need for revitalization? There are several signs. If you are following the summary that I put online, this second section is in a slightly different order than the paper that you may have downloaded. I apologize for that. I changed it after sending the paper off. Anyway, these are at least 8 signs of decline. The first one is that Christians no longer dare to invite people from the outside into the church. That it functions in such a way that people won't understand what's going on. As we say in French, they don't have the codes. They don't know how it works, and it doesn't seem relevant to them in any way. So that is a sign of decline, that Christians no longer dare to invite people from the outside, non-believers, to come into the church. The second thing is a numerical decrease. This may not be obvious at first. It's one of the reasons why, as a pastor, I always tried to keep account of the number of people present in the meetings that I held, whether it's worship services or other things, just to get a little bit of objectivity into where we were numerically, to see if we really were still increasing or decreasing. But if there is a decrease in numbers, that that is also accompanied often by an increase in the average age of the members of the church. A third sign of decline is that the structure and the activities become more important than genuine, authentic life in Christ. In other words, routine sets in. And the expression we have in England, I don't know if it's in English, I don't know if it's true in America or elsewhere, we say we are going through the motions. I don't know if you have that expression, but it means that it's a routine. You have a service, you come to the service, you know what's going to happen. It will happen probably about the same way every week. People are happy to meet each other. They're happy because at least they don't feel in a minority like they do in society. And so they're happy to do this, but true, genuine spiritual life gets pushed out by the just making sure that activities are happening and the structure is kept in place. Fourth sign, this happens very often, especially in quite smaller churches, that family dynasties rule the church. Maybe there is a very strong family there at the beginning. Their children marry other people. So there is an influence in the church, which is not necessarily reflected in the leadership group or the church board, but there are people who have an influence in the church. And this influence, unfortunately, is nearly always in the same direction to stop change. They want to be faithful, they say, to the founder of the church. And so they don't want any change. And this can lead to, number 5, a culture of taboos. Certain subjects just cannot be brought up in the church or in church meetings. So there is a resistance to change. People live in the past and the way things happen, a kind of nostalgia. Oh, it was really great 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 50 years ago, but it's not so good now. So you live in the past. But unfortunately, that involves also not accepting that we need to do things in new ways. And a lot of people have said that the COVID pandemic has been helpful in this, of forcing change where otherwise change wouldn't have taken place. There can also be a culture of triumphalism, whereby people say, we're doing it the right way. It's non-Christians who need to change. It's not us. We're doing everything right. And so fundamentally, and this is probably the worst thing of all, the Great Commission is forgotten. You keep the church going, and sometimes even the gospel is forgotten. Don Carson, I've seen him and heard him say on more than one occasion that if you stop talking about the gospel and not keeping the gospel in the center, the next generation will still sign a confession of faith to become a member of the church, which talks about the gospel, but other things become more important. And the generation after that doesn't even see the need for the gospel at all. So it's very important to say that a sign of decline is the gospel is no longer so central. I also want to just say very, very quickly that I think that revitalization is a biblical concept. I've heard people say, even in France, it's easier to give birth than raise the dead. They mean by that, it's easier to plant a new church than to revitalize an existing church. But I think actually that revitalization runs through the whole of the Bible. We haven't got time to go into this in detail, but just a few examples, remembering that in Romans 15:4, it says that everything that was written in the past was written to teach us. Judges, a verse that we didn't hear just now, chapter 2, verses 10 and verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. But what we did hear was that there is a cycle of decline and calling to the Lord, decline and calling to the Lord. And if that isn't revitalization, what is? And we see the same thing, for example, in the whole stories of the kings of Judah in Israel, in Kings and Chronicles. Kings get worse and worse, and then the Lord raises up a good king who will fight idolatry and bring the Lord back into it, and they revitalize Israel. And we see it also in the post-exilic books, in which the prophets, that people come back from exile, they're willing and ready to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, but after a while, the zeal drops away. And I think one of the verses that always touches me is in Haggai chapter 1, where God says to the people, "My house remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with his own house." And that can happen. Instead of the gospel and the mission, evangelism, being together as a church to encourage each other, each person is interested in their own life. And that's a very postmodern materialist way of thinking. And then in the New Testament, 7 letters to 7 churches, only 2 don't receive any criticism. 5 are told to repent. Ephesus, the loss of their first love. Pergamum, the need to fight against error. Thyatira, the need to fight against sin and immorality. Sardis, the church has a reputation of being alive, but is dead. And Laodicea, the church is lukewarm. So again, 5 different reasons for the need of revitalization. One size doesn't fit all. And that's what we see with the different contexts of revitalization. I see 4 different contexts in which this takes place. Firstly, the region within Europe. Northern Europe, with a strong Protestant tradition, has a lot of very old churches that need revitalization, whereas Eastern Europe, the problem is after the persecution of the Marxist era, the openness to the gospel after the fall of communism, and now the input of postmodernism coming from Western Europe has meant that churches are no longer in phase with society as it's developing. Whereas Southern Europe, Latin Europe, it's much more the need for revitalizing the second generation of churches planted in the 70s, 80s, or even 90s. So that's 3 different contexts within Europe. Secondly, the ecclesiastical tradition. It won't happen in the same way in the traditional Lutheran, Reformed, or Anglican churches as it will in the more free churches, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, and so on. A third context is the context of the situation of the church. I'm in Paris, the megapolis is certainly not the same as in a smaller city or a town or a rural area. Each place, the revitalization will look different. And this also depends on the stage in which the church finds itself. So the stages which often a church will go through, the church is planted, it goes through a period of growth, and then it plateaus, starts to decline, and move towards extinction, like the Tasmanian Tiger. This kind of curve is valid in all sorts of areas. A company, a commercial company, often knows that. They've got a new product, it grows a lot, they stop innovating, and then they start to decline. It happens in all areas of life, in fact. So it's not a surprise it happens in the churches as well. So some churches realize they need revitalization when they get to the very bottom, the danger of extinction. It's probably more often, but it's not always too late, but it may be, is when a church realizes it's in decline. But if you see the pointer on my screen, if I can find it, there we are, the place where revitalization would probably be the best was about there, when the growth is beginning to slow down, and something new needs to be done before they get to the plateau stage. Um, my apologies, this is in French, that I didn't have time to put it into English, but the diagram is clear that if you're beginning to plateau, then you need a new dynamic to set in at the time. Something must change before going back down to routine and the dead end and what they call their agony, which is the death. So with these four variables, the type, the region of Europe, the ecclesiastical tradition, the geographical context, city, rural area, and so on, and the stage of the church, there is no one size fits all for revitalization. It has to personalize, but I think there are principles, and these are the what we want to work on during this week. What are the principles that will enable us to revitalize the church? And the first thing is to say that the most important thing is not to start from the situation that you might be in, but to ask the question, what is a healthy church? And it's taken me several years to get to this. Very, very simple definition. But this simple definition, I think, is actually quite deep. That a healthy church is a church which, through the gospel, there's no other way that it can be healthy, through the gospel means that people will learn to love God, to love people, each other and non-Christians, in the cultural context where the church is. That is a healthy church. And I think if you look through the New Testament, you'll find that nearly everything comes back to that. A healthy church is through the gospel, where people love God, love people in their cultural context. So that means that we can talk about a three-dimensional approach to building a healthy church. So if it's loving God, there's a spiritual dimension. If it's loving people, it's a social dimension. In the cultural context, the societal dimension. And these are the three areas in which any church must work, whether it's whatever part of Europe, whatever stage it's at, whether it's a big city or a village, working on the spiritual, the social, and the societal levels. And I'll just add that I think this is important because some people pray for revival, and that's great. I would never stop someone praying for revival. But revival, as is usually being conceived or thought of, is usually just the spiritual, or mainly the spiritual dimension, and is firstly and foremost on an individual level. Nothing wrong with that, except that for a long-term process, we have to think in terms of the social dimension and the societal dimension as well. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that. Some people know this. When I was a student many years ago, I was in Bristol in the UK. I was born in England, and though I spent all my adult life in France, as I said, but I was a student in the United Kingdom. And in our little Methodist church, there was an old lady who had lived through the Welsh revival at the beginning of the 20th century. And she loved to invite the students to her home to drink a cup of tea. And she would talk at length about the Welsh revival. But in the UK today, Wales is one of the places where the evangelical churches are the weakest. So it doesn't mean that a revival is a long-term thing. Revitalization is a richer and more long-term idea. So what is the process that we're going to be suggesting that we go through? There are several parts to this. This is just a summary of it. I think the first thing is that there must be an awareness of the need. If no one in the church is aware of the need, it won't happen. If one person is aware, hopefully they will find other people who will be aware of the need and they can work together. But if the leadership refuses, I really don't think there's very much hope. I'm a bit negative on that, a bit pessimistic. But if the leadership don't want to know, I think it would be impossible to revitalize the church. Anyway, let's assume for the moment that this awareness has led to some people saying, yeah, we really want to go ahead with this. So I think the first stage is to create a little revitalization team with those who are aware of the need, with maybe the present leadership team and the pastor, maybe not everyone there, but this team, I think, should be recognized by the church in a church meeting in some way as having the authority to think about this and to start working towards revitalization. So this team, the first thing they're going to do, I think, is to assess or evaluate the state of the church. This can be done in all sorts of ways. There may be questionnaires, there may be interviews, there may be meetings or whatever. Because if you think of the prophets in the Old Testament, in, I think, the book of Samuel, it says the prophets used to be called seers. And what did they see? They saw, first of all, the reality of the situation in Israel, and then they saw what could result from that. So they saw that if there wasn't repentance, certain things would happen, but if there was repentance, other things could happen. So the evaluation is to try to see as clearly as possible the reality of the church in all sorts of ways. What is the age groups? Where do people live? What kind of relationships do they have? What activities are being done? Just to be honest. That's the first stage, to be honest. And from there, I think that this revitalization team then should work at crafting or creating a vision in these three areas: the spiritual, the social, and societal. What can we do? Where do we want to get to with the situation we're in? It's not a question of dreaming. It's a question of saying, from where we are, where could we get to? What is possible in our situation? I'll give it a practical example of that. I was once consulting for a church in France who told me they had a real vision to reach out to young people. But in fact, there weren't many young people in the church. But as I discussed with them, I found that several other people in the church loved painting. They were artists and so on. And I said, one thing you can do is to join local artist groups, get to know other artists. That is one thing you can work on. You can bring in maybe an art group into the church. This was a reasonable thing to do from their situation. So the revitalization team should sort of craft this vision and then to find the process of how to get there. And they will communicate this in such a way, hopefully, that they will be able to communicate it and get as many people on board as they possibly can. And I'll just say a very brief word, because we'll say more about this on another occasion. But we have set up for about the last 6 or 7 years, 7 years I think now, a year-round mentoring group on revitalization, which you can join. It's not too late to do this. And through the whole of a year, we go through this process from A to F and beyond in a very practical way. I lead this with Daniel Fedorian, who you may see on the screen, or when you go back onto the gallery, you'll see him. And I would encourage you to think in terms of joining this revitalization year-round mentoring. We really get to know each other. We share our needs. We work very, very strategically on the church which you are in. And this can have repercussions even on the level of your area or your nation.